Welcome to the season 2 of the India Energy Hour podcast. The India Energy Hour podcast explores the most pressing hurdles and promising opportunities of India's energy transition through an in-depth discussion on policies, financial markets, social movements, and science. The podcast is hosted by energy transition researcher and author Dr. Sandeep Pai and senior energy and climate journalist Shreya Jay. The show is produced by multimedia journalist Tejas Dayananda Sagar.
As COP27 inches closer, the promises and commitments made during the last global climate conference are under scrutiny. India, which was the biggest surprise thanks to its net zero target year announcement, has been under the scanner for laying out its climate plans. The Union Cabinet recently approved India's nationally determined contributions, which, though exhaustive, is still falling short on several fronts, major being climate adaptation. While mitigation measures are being given due importance, specific targets are yet to be drafted. In order for India, among other large economies, to step up its mitigation and adaptation efforts, it needs to raise ambition domestically, bringing policy coherence across the central and state governments, and ensuring access to finance from rich countries. To understand how India should prioritize its mitigation and adaptation efforts, we interviewed Harjeet Singh, Senior Advisor at Climate Action Network. Harjeet is a global expert on issues of climate impacts, migration, and adaptation, and has spent 2 decades working in developing sectors.
Thank you so much, Harjeet, for coming on the India Energy Hour. It's our absolute delight and obviously an honor to have you here. As Sandeep said, we have been trying to get you to our podcast for quite some time, and we are very, very happy and looking forward to have this great discussion with you. Good that we have a very, as I say, a timely topic right now, but I'm sure that we'll go deep and long into the issue. So thanks again for joining us here.
Thank you, Shreya, and thank you, Sandeep, for having me. My pleasure to join the podcast.
Before we go into the topic, which is that we discuss about India's climate commitments and varied issues that come with it, let's just start first with you. Tell us about yourself. What has your journey been like? And, to be in climate sector is very, very challenging. So I want to know that was it by choice? Was it by accident? Do you regret it? But yes, tell us about your professional journey. How did you come into this sector? Where are you from? What did you study, etc.?
Okay, I don't know how interesting the journey is, but let me share how I am in the climate sector. So I come from a small town called Sitapur in the state of Uttar Pradesh, and I did my master's in business administration with specialization in rural marketing. And when I was studying rural marketing, that's how I developed interest in rural development. And then I realized that I don't want to pursue career in the corporate sector. Interestingly, the first job that I got was with Professor Anil Kumar Gupta from IIM Ahmedabad, who has been into rural innovations, and he founded an organization called Srishti. And he had a project on biodiversity conservation and protection in north of Gujarat. And that's where I got involved as research associate. And I never knew that I'm going to be working on environmental issues later in my life. So that's how my career started. And then I joined the core team of Give Foundation, which actually launched GiveIndia.org, which is now the India's largest and most trusted donation platform. And then I spent 2 years there. In fact, we went to Mumbai to do a lot of fundraising with corporates. But then with my kind of interest in the development sector, living in Mumbai, I felt I was losing touch with the grassroots work. And then there was a post in ActionAid India, in Lucknow regional office. I applied for that and I got it. And then I spent 19 years in ActionAid until last year. And I started my journey there with managing development projects. And then I somehow developed interest in the emergency response work. And then tsunami struck in December 2004. And I decided to go to Andaman Nicobar Islands without knowing where I'm landing. And I spent 2.5 years in Andaman and Nicobar Islands. I was managing the rehabilitation and reconstruction efforts after tsunami for ActionAid India. In 2007, then I joined the international team. And during my work to help communities recover from tsunami impact and also be more prepared, that's how I learned much more about climate change. And I realized this is the issue that I need to be working on. So my entry into the climate sector is from humanitarian and disaster risk reduction. And then I never looked back. In fact, when I led a study on adaptation, I was emergency advisor for Asia and America. So I was responding to various emergencies. So yeah, I was there for several years, and my last post was as global lead on climate change for ActionAid. And then last April 2021, I joined Climate Action Network as senior advisor, and also Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty as strategic advisor. And a few years before, I must also share, after Paris Agreement, which we all knew, some of us felt really, really frustrated that on one hand, yes, the whole world was now walking in the same direction, but we knew that targets were not enough, and we are going to be landing in a very, very bad situation if we continue that trajectory. And I personally felt that I don't have enough motivation to continue with the policy space unless and until I do something else. And that's how my wife and I started an organization called Satat Sampada, a social enterprise in 2016, which started looking into organic farming and environmental solutions. And that was another motivation for me to quit ActionAid and work, for my own organization. And we are now a partner of Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative and managing global partnerships. So yeah, that has been my journey so far. And now with CAN, my role is as the head of global political strategy, and I continue to be based in New Delhi.
But what has been the jump like from social sector to now strictly climate? I'm not sure if we can call it a strictly climate because the impact is across sectors. But what has been the transition like? Was there any defining moment? Like you said, tsunami happened while you were with ActionAid. Was there any defining moment which made you choose that, climate is the core of it? That's where I should be, because that is the point from where the most impact and action will happen.
Well, for me, it was not a major jump because we were not looking at climate change just as an environmental issue. Being in ActionAid, it was very clear that climate change is affecting the most vulnerable communities and countries hardest. And they are the ones who had no role in causing the crisis in the first place. So for us, it was an issue of inequality, an issue of injustice. That was our starting point. For us, it was an extension of our fight for social justice. And that's how we always said climate justice and not climate change related work. And in fact, the reason you see little action in the last 30 years, one reason for that is development community got involved much, much later in the discourse. Because when you put people at the center, then the issue becomes real. And that's how when climate change was just a scientific issue or environmental issue, it did not get much traction. When it became a hardcore development and the issue which revolves around economics, that's how it has become so relevant for everybody.
Harjeet, there's so many strands of interesting stuff that I want to ask you. But let me ask you something like that I'm very interested in knowing. So I know that you have worked a lot in India, and I know that you also work a lot with international partners such as Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation, Sapura, and like others. So my question is, like, each country context is so different, right? How do you navigate that space where a lot of times I see this Western narrative? I'm not criticizing anybody, but like the country context in Canada is very different, or US is very different than India, right? So how do you navigate that space where you're able to, I'm not being skeptical or anything else, but a lot of these initiatives come always from the West, right? Because perhaps for, systemic reasons, they have more funding, the initiatives, etc., etc. There's more uptake. How do you navigate that space where you're able to educate, I don't know if educate is the right word, but your international partners about the country realities, at the same time align, the interests of a country like India. Like, so I don't know if that question is clear, but there's always that tension between like how different and how the framing of some of these international discourses in a Canada versus an India is different. And I think you're sitting in the middle of that tension. And my question is like, how do you navigate that space? And do you find it challenging to navigate that space?
It's a very important and very relevant question, I must say, Sandeep. In the climate context, it's a reality that majority of these campaigns have come from the West. Reasons, science developed there much, much earlier. And we also know that when it comes to policy analysis and campaigning, West has been leading that area for a very long time. And particularly when it comes to international aspects. Developing countries who are stuck, with day-to-day realities and struggles and challenges and coming out of poverty, for them to invest in any of these disciplines which are very futuristic is not easy. And that's a reality that we face in developing countries. And even now, when we talk about climate is not our big banner campaign. For us, it still remains food, water, energy now, much more. And we want to protect forest, not for climate change reasons, but for many other reasons, environmental protection and, looking at it from the perspective of indigenous communities. Our issues have been very different. Our struggles and realities have been very different. Having said that, there has been a very complex situation where you find that some of these narratives that our friends from the global north brought were not relevant for our context, or they did not get the whole picture. The way they were talking about environmental protection, they completely excluded people. In fact, many of the environmental campaigns were anti-people. And here in this part of the world, in the global south, we don't look at environment versus people. We know people are also part of the environment. So yes, in many cases, we found the narrative coming from global north was problematic. But we've also found many allies in the global north who wanted to understand that perspective, who created space for global south. And of course, our leaders from the global south also created, because we come from a land of struggles. We come from a land of movements. So our perspective was more people-centric, and we could articulate that. It took time. It took a lot of resources and energy, because we had to pool resources as a block of developing countries. But in the end, we were able to articulate, and that's how the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change has equity and has those principles of common but differentiated responsibilities are embedded, because developing countries pushed for that.
Okay, great. I think I can go on and ask you these kinds of provocative questions, but let's dive in to the topic, and maybe perhaps as we are asking sort of questions about the topic, I may reference back to some of your, experiences. So I think currently the one story that is hitting sort of headlines, or one of the stories, there's always lots of stories in India that hit headlines, is about India's NDCs, or nationally determined contributions. So recently, the cabinet approved India's latest NDCs. There were some hits, there were some misses. What do you think is missing? And what do you think is positive from the list?
I'm sure your listeners have the context that only two of the targets were revised, where one related to emission intensity target of GDP, which has now been increased to 45% from a previous target of 33 to 35%, and both are for 2030. And the cumulative electric power installed capacity will now also be increased to 50%. Of course, we were expecting much more, and particularly things that did not feature, which PM Modi announced in Glasgow last year, which was at least 500 gigawatt of India's installed electricity generation capacity to be from non-fossil fuels. And also, he referred to at least 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent reduction in 2020s. So those two things were not mentioned. And this is where we do feel that government should have mentioned a roadmap, particularly for the domestic community. Because we know when we talk about NDCs, we have to put things into context. You are actually committing yourself to the international community. And what's happening right now, because countries are being asked to revise their targets, but when it comes to international finance, that has not been coming through. All the recent reports have not met their targets of providing $100 billion a year starting 2020. So on one hand, we should definitely scrutinize what government has put forward as part of NDCs. But for real action, it's important to see what India is doing at the domestic level. And that's where we do feel that India has to really up its target domestically, particularly meet its target of 500 gigawatt, which we think can be achieved. Of course, it's not going to be easy because where we stand right now, we have to triple our target when it comes to renewable energy, and which would require billions of dollars. And in the NDC, India did refer that international financial support is absolutely must. And another thing that was missing of sorts was the sectoral level targets, which in fact in its clarification, India did mention that they didn't want to put it as NDCs, but they will be developing those targets, which I think are absolutely important to advance progress domestically in the real world.
I have two follow-up questions. Let me first just quickly ask you something regarding this 500 gigawatt and 50% non-fossil fuel energy. So what the Power Minister has clarified to the Parliament is that we do not submit absolute targets in our NDCs to the UNFCCC. We rather submit the percentage. So if we are submitting that 50% of our energy needs would be met from non-fossil fuel sources, that means the other 50% is coming from fossil fuel. Simple calculation. How feasible does that look like to you? 1000 gigawatt that would be. So 500 would be coal. So that amount of investment will continue to happen till 2030 and another 500 gigawatt. Does it make sense?
Well, when it comes to environmental protection and where we stand in terms of climate crisis, it doesn't make sense at all. And that's where we should actually come up with a roadmap. When we talk about achieving net zero by 2070, we have to talk about how we are going to achieve and what kind of trajectory we will be having. And this is where, by just mentioning percentages, basically they are trying to avoid pressure from the international community. And that's why I keep emphasizing, on one hand, we need to look at what India is submitting to the international community, but more importantly, what we are doing domestically. And I think this is where we need to look at how we quickly phase out from coal, oil, and gas. And in case of India, it's coal primarily, which we depend on. And this is where the issues of just transition become really important, because when you have millions of workers in the coal industry and related sectors, how you will make sure that you will move away from coal. Of course, there are other technological challenges as well in terms of energy storage. But yes, India has to come out with a plan where we have to talk about phase out as well, while we are more comfortable talking about phase down.
Interesting. Harjeet, can you touch upon, the question of like climate impacts, right? And how would climate impacts delay India's efforts on mitigation in general? Like, because climate resiliency is very important in our future energy system. Like, you have to build resilient system, but I think beyond just the energy infrastructure, how would climate impacts sort of delay, whether it's 2030 targets, whether it's the net zero goal? I think it'll be interesting to learn from you on that.
So we have already reached a point where we are not talking about climate disasters that are going to hit us in future. Impacts are all around us, whether we talk about extreme weather events like floods and cyclones, or slow onset events like sea level rise, ocean acidification, which we don't normally refer to, and they are really becoming massive impacts. And there are several estimates. As per an estimate from Overseas Development Institute, India may lose 3 to 10% of GDP annually by end of the century. And the poverty rates may also go up by 3.5% by 2040 due to climate change. And we have seen massive impacts over the last few years. And as per another report by WMO, World Meteorological Organization, that India lost $87 billion in 2020 due to natural disasters such as tropical cyclones, floods, and drought. So impacts are already there. We are losing billions of dollars. So imagine when we have to invest more money in the renewable energy sector, and we are forced to divert money to help people recover from these climate impacts, and international finance is not coming through, very clearly the ambition on mitigation is going to be affected. And we now talk about climate action in the form of three pillars: so mitigation, adaptation, and dealing with loss and damage. So we cannot just talk about mitigation. It was never the case, and some of us have been fighting against that narrative for a very long time, that you have to look at all these three pillars in continuum, mitigation, adaptation, and addressing loss and damage. And we have reached a point where all three are equally important for the entire world. Look at what's happening right now when it comes to impacts in other parts of the world as well. We are seeing forest fires, we are seeing floods, we are seeing drought. Europe is suffering from massive heat waves and drought and wildfires. So that's the situation. So for everybody, it's important. And for India in particular, because we have huge vulnerability, because our many economic sectors are very climate sensitive. So for us, becoming resilient is absolutely fundamental.
Want you to touch upon this kind of imbalance that is there in our policy, and it has been there always. Mitigation gets the larger pie rather than adaptation. With the current set of commitments, it doesn't look like things have changed much. Can you first of all explain what are the perils of this mismatch and how can adaptation be addressed better?
It's extremely important for us to listen to states and districts when we develop our climate policy. The reality is that our climate policies, particularly when we engage at the international level, are developed by central government. And we have not seen enough consultations happening between states and central government to actually understand what the issue is. And that's how our discourse at the international level has been very mitigation centric. We did not look at how climate change is going to impact our communities and our economy. And as I said, because we did not consult states and people on ground, we only focused on so-called protecting our development space and making sure that our mitigation targets are not going to affect our development, and how we can get finance, particularly for our mitigation targets. If you analyze the state climate change action plans, you will see majority of states have actually prioritized adaptation over mitigation, because they are facing the reality of climate disasters. And India, as a country where still about 60% people rely on agriculture directly or indirectly, imagine what role climate plays in their day-to-day lives or the economy of those states. So clearly, there is a mismatch between what people need or what states need and what central government has been aspiring for and engaging at the international level.
I have a follow-up question and then a bigger question. The follow-up question is, I understand the spirit that it has to come from state and districts. I completely understand, right? That's where all the action is. That's where all the impacts are. But to be ambitious, is it hard to build that consensus, given there's so many political dynamics between local, central, opposition party, and then also be ambitious? Like if India could set up a committee to engage with every state, every district, that committee could create one plan for the country, going ground up, and then India could submit something and not be top down. I find it really challenging how to balance the two and also be ambitious. Do you have any thoughts on that? And then I'll ask you my bigger question.
Sure. So no single approach is good enough. So in some cases, when you are, let's say, measuring the potential of renewable energy, probably a top-down study and being more aspirational works. But when it comes to measuring impact on ground, you can't do that sitting in a boardroom and do a desktop analysis. This is where you have to go to the ground and listen to people who are facing these impacts and get ground realities, talk to local administration, talk to states, and that's when you get the information. So what you need is bottom up, top down, and also sideways, where you have those discussions. And we have not seen bottom up and sideways conversations happening. It has been only top down. That is the challenge. And as I said, when states were asked to develop their climate change action plans, adaptation without government telling them became a priority for them, because that came from ground. So yes, it's not easy, but then we don't have any other option in a democracy where you have to listen to people. It's time consuming. but that's the right approach. But at the same time, we can be aspirational, and that's where our leadership, because when we go to international fora, we face those pressures, we exert pressures on others. So I think that's a give and take process. And when we come back, then we raise our ambition. So it's part of the process.
Thank you for saying I like the sideways reference. So speaking of, bottom up, and one of the topics that I like and which is pretty, I think, very bottom up is the topic of just transition for workers, communities, states that will be impacted. I know that India is perhaps in talks with rich countries to set up a just energy transition partnership like South Africa last year. It seems like it's a very top-down process. Perhaps it will have no reference to coal. First of all, how important is this topic of just transition? I mean, I think it's very important because I've worked on it for a long time. But in your opinion, how important it is from a more ambitious target point of view, but also from a justice point of view? And also, can you also talk about how should this partnership be built? Like in South Africa, it was a little bit more bottom up, there were a lot of analysis done and then that culminated into some negotiations. But in India's case, it seems like states and communities have no idea what's going on. That's a long question, but thoughts from you on this.
So the word just in just transition is extremely important because transition is happening. We can increase the pace of that transition, which is absolutely needed. But whether that transition has justice embedded into it is the fundamental question. And why do we need justice? Because as we are moving away from fossil fuels to cleaner energy, we also have to make sure that people who are engaged in those traditional sectors and sectors like coal and coal dependent sectors, we have to make sure that those people get support to move away from those jobs. A very simple example in Indian context, a coal miner in Jharkhand cannot become a solar engineer who can be employed in Gujarat in a matter of 5 years. It will not happen. We have to have a plan for coal miners and people who are based on that coal economy. And when we talk about investing in renewable energy, that requires a totally different institutional setup. So how we are going to make that transition, which will not cause social and economic disruption, that's about justice. And this is where we need to devise principles of just transition, how we are going to listen to people. In fact, ILO does talk about the concept of social dialogues. And there is a concept where communities are going to be involved. We as civil society say, don't look at community as just one of the stakeholders. Community has to be at the center of it because they are the ones who will be facing the brunt of that disruption if our transition is not just. And this is where we feel that we have to have a plan. We have to listen to people when we are designing this just transition. And it should not just remain a concept. It has to get real. And you are right, we have not seen examples where we are consulting communities or consulting local authorities and developing those plans, which is about nuts and bolts, which is about investing into rescaling, which is about creating institutions, which is about thinking of economic diversification, 5 years and investing into it 5 years, 10 years, and looking at 5 years, 10 years from now. So it really requires a very different thinking. And I really don't hear that discourse enough. And it's only recently you find some of these conversations happening. But still, community is actually missing from this.
Just wanted to get your thoughts on if you have followed or do you have any insights on India's potential just energy transition partnership with rich countries. We hear a lot about that. G7 had a statement saying that, they're consulting with India. I don't know if you have any insights or thoughts on that.
No, before we talk about just energy transition partnership for India, let's first talk about where it all originated, South Africa. And I work very closely with my colleagues in South Africa. Trust me, there is no plan. They have not yet seen the money. And some of the insiders have told us that a lot of old money is going to be recounted. So we are talking about what, $8.5 billion? They have not even seen $8 million on the table yet. It's still a bubble. And the important question is, what that just transition mean to people? When we talk about transfer of money and resources, is it going to go to big energy companies who are actually incurring losses at this moment? So, on that basis, they can make a case to absorb that money, or that money is going to workers and communities who are dependent on coal and other fossil fuels to have an alternate means of livelihoods. How they are going to be rehabilitated and reskilled. We still don't hear what are going to be the principles of just transition, what's going to be the process, who will get the money, and what kind of institutions are being put in place to enable that just transition. So we are following an example of South Africa, which is not an example yet. So I have my own fears of that we are actually making a castle in the air without knowing that what it's going to deliver. And in fact, the whole concept of just transition provides us an opportunity to build something which is contextual, which is something that speaks to our reality and not copy a model from somewhere else. Each country is so different. And this is where we have to look at what our economic sectors are, what kind of skills we have as a society, and what is needed. So yes, as a concept, it's absolutely valuable, but we need to, develop nuts and bolts on our own.
Good, you touched upon money. Money is my favorite part in this whole discussion. Let's just first start with the recent announcement, because the government approval of India's NDC that came had a very interesting line in it, and I'll read it. That India's climate action have so far been largely financed from domestic sources. However, we would need new additional financial resources as well as transfer of technology, and India will also require its due share from such international financial resources and technological support. Now, that is a great line if you read it. But I want to first of all understand from you that making such demands here, I don't think we have used this language in the past, but you would be the best person to clarify on that. And compared to what we are saying here in domestically versus what we say globally, are we asserting us for this international finance to come in India? And I'll also ask you that you have been an advocate of this, rich countries paying for our loss and damage, paying for our adaptation. So if you can first explain on how assertive India has been on these global platforms, any results that have come out of it, and probably a little bit on the way forward.
I'll just add one thing to Shreya's question. Harjeet, it'll be very useful if you can also give a little bit of context on loss and damage. What do we mean by this? And then go to your finance question.
Sure. So when we talk about loss and damage, basically we refer to climate impacts that people are facing right now or are going to face inevitably in future. And loss and damage here in this case means impacts from cyclones, drought, floods, sea level rise, oceans turning acidic or melting of glaciers, when people lose their homes, their farms, their livelihoods. And you cannot categorize it under adaptation, because adaptation is about preventing such impacts, which means we prepare well in advance. So that's why when we talk about climate action, we say mitigation, so that we can avoid the problem itself in the first place. And now that some of the impacts are already locked in, because we are already living in a 1.2 degree warmer world, we need to prepare, and that's where adaptation comes in. But because we have not invested sufficiently in adaptation, we are already facing loss and damage. So that's the continuum or the spectrum of climate action, the way we look at it.
And then the question about finance.
And on finance, so India, no doubt, has been extremely vocal on the issue of climate finance for decades. But over the last few years, one really wonders why India is not putting enough pressure with the kind of specifics that are needed. And that is also a problem with this particular NDC. And this is something I have been saying for a very long time. Why don't you very clearly define your conditional and non-conditional actions? We made the same mistake in the first NDC that we submitted. We quoted a figure of $2.5 trillion and we said, we need that much money for the entire range of climate action. And in fact, adaptation and loss and damage were also included in that framing. And when you want to get into details, there is not enough breakup available. And this time, Shreya, you very rightly said, it gets a little bit closer. In fact, not in the main release, but in the FAQs that government circulated separately, the second target where they talked about increasing the cumulative electric power installed capacity to 50%, that was linked to conditional, to international finance, but not with that language, and it's still not very sharp. That is my biggest problem with this NDC and also the previous one. Why don't you come up with a plan and say, this is what we are going to do with our own resources, and that's where we need international finance? And please go and define what kind of international finance you need. Do you need loans? You need guarantees? You need grants? You need technical support? That's how you negotiate. And by just making some of these lofty comments, it doesn't help when you go to climate negotiations. Climate negotiations is about those details. And we are now at a time when we have to put forward plans. NDCs are nothing but indicative plans. So why India is not putting forward specific plans is something I really fail to understand.
But then we have become a country of lofty promises and no details. Jokes apart, good you mentioned that, the specifics are missing. And this particular complaint also comes from developed countries. You talk to these developmental expert people who track the money that flows from the global north to the global south. And they consistently have this particular criticism, not just for India, but for other developing nations as well, that while there's always a figure of, say, 2 trillion, 2.5 trillion, they never have specifics. So if UK is giving some developmental funds or loans, I'm supposed to know where that money is going. You cannot just ask me 2.5 trillion. Okay, I understand polluter pays, but what is the polluter paying for? So these specifics never come in. And that has hurt our cause more than theirs. They would want to save in money. But now I want you to address this in the context that compared to what was happening 2 years back, things have changed significantly post-COVID. Every country is realigning their budgets towards public health and obviously cutting down funding from wherever possible. And as I have learned, you would be the best person to certify that such funding, climate funding, developmental funding is where the scissors run the first. So how things stand now? What can a country like India expect in terms of getting financial doles from the global north?
Well, when it comes to grants, India is not, in the top order anyway. Most of the grants are going to Africa and other least developed countries. So for India, it's mostly seen as a country where the Western world would like to invest, right, or provide guarantees and offer loans. It could be long-term, low-interest loans. I'm not saying India should not get grants, but given the amount of money that is available, it's much more needed by small and vulnerable nations. And this is where all developing countries should actually put forward those specific numbers. And for India, where it has a strong market and business sector, it should come out with a plan on what kind of financial instruments it actually needs to meet its requirement. And this is where, as I was saying, India has not been very specific. And that's not the right move, because we are now in the implementation mode. It's not that, we go to these climate talks and only for negotiation. Things are happening on ground. We have put forward specific targets. We now have to put money behind it so that we can actually implement those plans. Did I answer your question? I think I missed something, Shreya.
You mentioned that, India is not in the position as much, but I wanted to understand what trend are you witnessing globally? Is this observation correct that post-COVID developing countries would face a lot more problems getting climate fund?
Well, not just COVID. The war in Ukraine is already affecting the flow of aid to developing countries, and already hearing that developed countries are now going to prioritize rebuilding and reconstruction in Ukraine. In fact, right now they are prioritizing even military support as part of aid. So we are definitely going to see aid cuts for developing countries, and which will also mean that less money for climate. And I have already been told by many negotiators from the global north that it's going to be very difficult again this year to meet the target. And there was a recent report by OECD, which again said that 100 billion target is not being met. And we still have a shortfall of about $17 billion. And this is when 71% continue to remain loans.
Should we be then more Atmanirbhar in the financing then and, reduce our expectations as such? Or is it not fair? We should continue to, by we, I mean developing nations should continue to clamor for international funding.
Well, absolutely. The reason we go to these international forums when it comes to climate, it's about justice. It's not a domestic issue. A handful of countries, a handful of corporations have caused the problem. And we should not forget that 100 companies are responsible for more than 70% of emissions. And the US and Europe are responsible for more than 50% of cumulative emissions in the atmosphere. And that's what caused climate change. So rich countries and corporations have to pay for mitigation actions and also dealing with climate impacts in the developing countries. So we should never let developed countries off the hook, and we should rather continue to put much more pressure. In fact, what's happening right now is all these struggles are coming together. Now, when we talk about climate justice, we are not only talking about climate justice, we are also talking about what the economic policies of the West have done to developing countries, how colonialism has played a role in causing this crisis. And it's also linked to social justice and even racial justice.
That's great. Let's talk about COP, right? COP27 is now around the corner, if I can say, if not really around the corner. What are your expectations from the COP? And most importantly, how do countries like India go from here to actually make this COP meaningful rather than, again, a set of lofty promises, and then we come to the next COP and the issues come up again? Like, what, if you were advisor to who's who in India, like what would be your advice to, the cabinet, and say, like, how do we go from here to make sure India gets maximum out of this COP?
Well, if I get to advise India, I would say, please be more specific in your plans and be more strategic. Like, had India specified what kind of money they needed, they would have had far more power to negotiate in these climate negotiations when we go to the international level. So going to the COP, I think it's extremely important for India to come up with specific figures on how much money India needs. And that will also help other developing countries to come up with specific figures and say, this is the finance gap that we are facing, so that we can tell the rich world that we are not able to meet our mitigation targets because you have not met your obligation of providing financial support, which you committed way back in 1992. And the figure of $100 billion first time came up in 2009. So it's very important to be more specific and clear in our demands. And second, let's not just talk about mitigation. We need to talk about the climate reality that we are facing right now as people are losing their homes and farms and income, that it is a real issue. And we also need to equally invest in adaptation and addressing loss and damage. And at COP27, you will find the issue of loss and damage is going to be an extremely important one, where we are demanding a loss and damage finance facility to be established. India supported the demand, and this time India has to stay strong and work with vulnerable countries to make sure that we get this facility. And third, India should continue to demonstrate leadership through its actions, but also demanding rich countries to not be hypocritical in their approach. On one hand, they put pressure on developing countries to have stronger mitigation targets, but look at what the developed world is doing right now in terms of investing much more fossil fuel infrastructure in Africa so that European countries can meet their deficit of gas and oil, which they are now not able to get from Russia. So it's a hypocrisy that Western countries have been living with for a very long time. And India should play a leading role in exposing this hypocrisy of the Western countries, because majority of these fossil fuel investments are happening either in the Western countries or by Western countries in the global South. I think it's really important to expose that.
You said that India should lead by example. So, on the domestic front, how much do you think policy development has taken in that direction? Having that bottom up approach, top down planning. And if you can cite some examples, has there been an approach like that? And if not, then if you can suggest some examples on how to go about it. You mentioned top, bottom, and sideways as well, and how to make our policies more inclusive. Obviously not leaving the sight of our targets, but keeping all the vulnerable communities also part of the planning.
Well, in case of renewable energy, I would say that India did involve states in helping them coming up with plans. And because this is the target that they committed and they really wanted action, and there have been, enabling policies that they are putting forward. But when it comes to coming up with a holistic plan on dealing with climate impacts, or now when we talk about just transition, away from fossil fuels, I think this is where we have not really invested enough in those discussions and making sure that we are listening to states and people on ground. And so this is where India also has to learn from other countries where some of these conversations are beginning to happen, and particularly working with labor unions, where we know that workers are going to be most affected by the transition that we are aiming for. So I would say that India has to do a lot more when it comes to working with our own states and our own people, particularly in the field of just transition and dealing with climate impacts.
I hate to conclude this discussion because it's such a nice, discussion flow that was happening. But I would like to ask you if there's anything that you would like to add, any facet of this discussion that you think that we missed, that you want to add to it.
I was referring to India should lead by example. It's very important to mention that some of the principles that we are fighting for at the international level, we talk about equity, we talk about justice, we talk about fairness. And these are very important principles to actually fight for. But at the same time, when we come back home, we also need to operationalize these. When it comes to energy access, when it comes to energy equity, we are not doing very well in our own country between states. And we know that when we are going to make that transition, there are going to be winners, there are going to be losers. And especially the coal producing states, where we have not invested sufficiently into economic diversification and we haven't come up with a plan on what will happen to those workers, I think those states are going to be losers. So within the country, we also have to operationalize those principles of equity, fairness, and justice.
Thank you, Harjeet. This has been so interesting. Thank you for your time.
And that's a nice closing statement as well.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the India Energy Hour. Subscribe to this channel to never miss an update. To drop us a feedback, visit our website or write to us at theindiaenergyhour@gmail.com. We are on Twitter. You can follow at TIEH_podcast and get in touch with the two hosts at Shreya_Jay and at Sandeep Pai with double I.